Welcome back to the California Coastal Commission April meeting. I'm going to send it back to Mr. Ainsworth.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Next item is item 6D, and this is the informational briefing on the state and federal efforts to reduce plastic marine debris in our oceans. And Sarah Christie will kick this off. Sarah?
Thanks, Jack. Last month, the commission requested a briefing on the state's current efforts to reduce single-use plastics and a status update on the plastics initiative, which has qualified for the November ballot. Today's briefing will consist of 3 parts. To start, I'll compare the ballot initiative and SB 54 by Senator Ben Allen and discuss the relationship between the two. Then Eben Schwartz, our Marine Debris Program Manager, will summarize the current state, federal, and international efforts to reduce plastic pollution. And finally, Caitlin Kalua, OPC's Water Quality Program Manager, will go over OPC's recent actions to address microplastics. Following this briefing, you'll be considering the adoption of a resolution committing the commission to holding single-use plastic-free meetings. So plastic pollution is a familiar topic in Sacramento. The legislature has made steady incremental progress over the last 4 decades, although clearly not fast or effectively enough to stem the flow. Many of them have focused on banning or regulating particular products or practices. But rather than go over 40 years worth of bills, I'm going to highlight just a few of the benchmarks that have brought us to where we are today. One of the most significant bills was the Integrated Waste Management Act of 1989, which created the Integrated Waste Management Board. It also set statewide solid waste diversion and recycling mandates and established a comprehensive program to incentivize and create markets for recycled materials and products. The Waste Management Board was abolished in 2009 and replaced with CalRecycle in 2010. CalRecycle has been implementing the Integrated Waste Management Act ever since, and it oversees the state's waste management, recycling, and waste reduction programs. In 2013, former coastal commissioners turned assembly members Mark Stone and Ben Hueso introduced AB 521, the first producer responsibility bill, which targeted the 10 most common plastic items identified through decades of data collected from Coastal Cleanup Day. AB 521 sought to shift the financial burden away from public entities and onto those responsible for marine plastic pollution. The Coastal Commission supported AB 521, and we worked closely with its authors, but facing a wall of industry opposition, the bill died in its first house. Still, it was noteworthy that it was the first bill that considered how producers themselves could be held responsible for the cost of recovering plastic items they produce or provide to consumers. By that time, it had become abundantly obvious that state and local agencies could not regulate plastic pollution into submission without substantial source reduction, as well as producer obligations for the recovery of their products. After that initial attempt, the legislature focused primarily on regulating specific items and materials, such as bottles, straws, plastic cutlery, nurdles, styrofoam, and microplastics, and the like. A series of plastic bag bans failed every session for almost a decade before California became the first state in the nation to impose a statewide ban on single-use plastic bags at large retail stores. The ban was set to take effect on July 1st, 2015, but an industry-backed referendum forced the issue onto the ballot in the November 2016 election. California voters passed Prop 67 with 52% of the vote, meaning the plastic bag ban approved by the legislature remains the law today. In 2019, Senator Ben Allen and Assemblymember Lorena Gonzalez introduced 2 identical measures, SB 54 and AB 1080, which the commission supported. Those bills, known as the California Circular Economy and Plastic Pollution Reduction Act, would have created a framework for shifting single-use packaging and food serviceware from disposable plastics to more sustainable alternatives. The bill had 3 key pillars. First, to reduce the amount of excess packaging through requirements on producers and move toward refill and reuse options. Second, to require that all the packaging and food serviceware on the market be fully recyclable or compostable. And third, shift the burden of paying for end-of-life management for this material from residents' garbage bills to the producers who are making the decisions about the type and volume of material they provide. SB 54 and AB 1080 made it further than AB 521 did in 2013, but failed passage at the end of the 2020 legislative session, prompting supporters to qualify a ballot measure to put the question before voters on the November 22 ballot. So not unlike in the 1970s, when coastal activists put Prop 20 on the 1972 ballot after 3 attempts at a coastal protection bill, the activists behind the plastics policy have turned instead to the initiative process. The California Plastic Waste Reduction Regulation Initiative qualified for the ballot 1 year later in July of 2021, gathering nearly 900,000 signatures. The measure would require CalRecycle to adopt provisions for producers related to the reduction of single-use plastic packaging and foodware. It would also require CalRecycle to impose a plastic pollution reduction fee on single-use plastic packaging and foodware. Revenues from the fee would be distributed to local governments and state agencies to upgrade waste disposal and recycling systems, support statewide composting, waste reduction, and the production of recycled material, and mitigation for the impacts of plastics in coastal, ocean, and river ecosystems. Commissioners Hart and Escalante are signatories to the measure, along with the former CEO of Recology. Meanwhile, also in 2021, well before the ballot initiative was qualified, Senator Allen reintroduced SB 54. The bill made it out of the Senate in January of this year, and it's currently pending in the Assembly. It contains the same basic pillars as its predecessor, but unlike the ballot measure, it's still able to be amended. Of course, there's no guarantee that the measure won't meet the same fate that it did in 2020, nor is the initiative a sure thing, although the plastic bag referendum seems like a good bellwether for it. But having an active bill with a committed author and a qualified initiative on the same subject creates an interesting window of both opportunity and ambiguity. That's because under legislation authored by Senator Steinberg in 2014, the legislature now has specific authority to negotiate a legislative alternative to a voter-led initiative. The statute allows the individuals who signed a ballot measure to withdraw it no less than 131 days prior to the election if the legislature passes and the governor signs legislation addressing the goals of the ballot measure. The statute also requires the legislature to hold hearings on ballot measures qualified by voters. This means that the legislature has one last opportunity to pass a bill on plastic packaging and foodware by the end of June. That's an ambitious timeline. But Senator Allen has been convening stakeholders in an attempt to see if a legislative solution is possible or preferable. Both the initiative and SB 54 contain the same basic goals with a few notable differences. The biggest difference is where the implementation burden falls. In the ballot measure and early versions of SB 54, source reduction and recyclability requirements are predetermined, and CalRecycle is given broad authority regarding how to regulate producers to reach those requirements. But over the last 3 years, observing what works in other countries, some perspectives are changing about how to make these programs effective. While the ballot measure cannot be changed at this point, SB 54 could still be amended to respond to this evolving understanding of how these programs work or don't. Senator Allen is considering amendments that would place the implementation burden squarely on producers, requiring producers to organize themselves into at least one, but possibly more, producer responsibility organizations, or PROs, tasked with bringing producers together to collectively reach the mandates in the legislation. This model has proven effective elsewhere in improving the collection and management of material, but more importantly, it responds to the concerns of some that CalRecycle may not have the capacity to interact directly with thousands of producers. In fact, if the ballot measure passes, Senator Allen believes that CalRecycle and the producers would likely need subsequent legislation, allowing them to form PROs to effectively comply. Another key distinction between the two measures is the level of specificity and certainty. Legislation can offer more details related to program implementation, while ballot measures necessarily leave many details to the regulatory implementation process. Flexibility and certainty both have their pros and cons, and this is not a situation where one measure is clearly better or stronger than the other. Certainty has the advantage of providing clarity about who does what, when, and how. Flexibility has the advantage of allowing for course corrections and adaptive management. The business community has expressed concern about what they see as a lack of clarity in the ballot measure and would prefer the legislature craft an alternative that would allow the ballot proponents to withdraw the measure. However, proponents of the ballot measure are skeptical that an industry can effectively regulate itself, or that a legislative compromise will accomplish all of the same goals as the initiative in time. But this isn't a turf war. Both Senator Allen and the initiative proponents are committed to supporting the best outcome for the environment. The most challenging aspects of finding an alternative solution will be how source reduction is articulated and how funding for addressing plastic pollution is allocated. With respect to funding, the ballot measure calls for a producer fee of up to 1 cent on packaging or foodware units. This money is used to fund improvements to state and local recycling and composting systems, as well as environmental mitigation measures. A key question in the SB 54 discussions is how much of the funding generated through a PRO is retained by the PRO, and how much is remitted to the state for grant programs managed by Cal EPA, Cal Recycle, and the Resources Agency. There's no doubt that crafting policy specifics for the program and getting it to the governor's desk by June will be a significant challenge. But after nearly 4 years of stakeholder discussion, the friction points are well known and some stakeholders seem motivated to find common ground. In the coming months, ongoing negotiations will determine whether California's next level of producer responsibility law will be enacted by the legislature or directly by the voters. It'll be interesting to watch. And now I'm going to hand it over to Eben Schwartz, who has the latest on other state, national, and international efforts.
Thank you, Sarah, and good morning, commissioners. I have a PowerPoint. Billy, if you could bring that up. Thank you very much. So I am going to speak to you briefly, just to give a brief overview of actions that are currently taking place at the state, federal, and international levels. But before we do that, it's good to have just a little bit of context on what we know about plastic pollution at this point. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Is that not working?
I think they're working. Oh, there you go.
There. Oh, can we back up? Sorry. Okay. Well, anyway, our state of knowledge on plastic pollution has grown exponentially since this was first identified as an issue of concern in the late 1970s. From our initial thoughts that this was a problem that originated primarily at sea, we now know that the vast majority of trash in our oceans comes from land. And where we were originally concerned about trash because of the aesthetic impacts on our coast, we now recognize that plastic pollution has enormous impacts on our economy, marine species, and potentially even on human health. And where we originally thought of plastic pollution as a relatively niche environmental issue, we now recognize that the production and disposal of plastic is a critical and cross-cutting environmental justice and climate issue as well. If current projections hold true, the plastics industry is set to increase production by 40% over the next 2 decades, which means that the plastic sector could account for as much as 20% of the world's oil consumption by 2050. This planned production increase does not bode well for the future in terms of plastic pollution. So although there is a lot being done to address different aspects of this issue, there is still much to be done. And that is one of the reasons why both SB 54 and the Plastic Initiative are so important. Next slide, please. There is a broad array of stakeholders involved in this movement, including state and local governments, philanthropies, and most significantly, the NGO and general public communities. You can see just a sampling of our partners on screen now. I like to believe that each of them got involved in this issue because they participated in one of our beach cleanups, and no one's going to convince me otherwise. It's worth noting the incredible contributions of the NGO community in particular to progress on this issue. Organizations like Surfrider, Heal the Bay, and many others have helped bring significant pressure and visibility to this issue. There's no doubt that without their contributions, we would not be nearly as advanced as we are. Next slide, please. Now, as you all know, historically, the Coastal Commission has been among the most active state agencies involved in the challenge of plastic pollution. Since 1985, we've brought more than 1.7 million volunteers out on Coastal Cleanup Day alone and removed more than 26 million pounds of trash from our coastal and inland watershed environments. Currently, the Commission is embarking on a new project, the Plastic Pollution Reduction Guidance Project. This project is going to create guidance for coastal staff to incorporate plastic pollution reduction measures into the Commission's planning, permitting, and enforcement work. We expect to bring the guidance to you for formal adoption by the end of June 2024. California is, without a doubt, a world leader in combating plastic pollution across the board, from our pioneering beach cleanup movements to legislation and regulations aimed at tackling the source of the problem. So I'd like to give you now a brief rundown on some of the most significant issues currently being addressed at multiple levels of government. Next slide, please. There are many different state agencies working on different aspects of this topic. CalRecycle, for example, is responsible for many different aspects since they oversee the state's waste management systems. Many of these aspects are informed by relatively recent legislation, but unfortunately, even in a state as advanced in these areas as California, our waste management system is still inadequate to address the growing tide of plastic pollution. There are many reasons for this, primarily that the systems in place and the federal laws governing those systems were designed well before plastic became the dominant form of packaging in the world. We do know that our waste management systems are inadequate to meet the current and future demands, and so CalRecycle is working right now to fill in some of those gaps by implementing AB 1332, which will establish a loan, grant, and incentive payment program to help achieve the goals in improving California's recycling and composting infrastructure. Next slide, please. The State Water Board is a major player in the plastic pollution realm in two main areas. First, in 2017, the trash amendment to the MS4 permit program was approved and certified, and that now requires that all permittees under the MS4 permit program have zero trash entering receiving water bodies from their stormwater systems. All of these permits are currently being revised to include the trash amendments as they come up for renewal, and they're all expected to be completed by the end of 2023, with full compliance expected by 2030. As of now, only 2 of these permits have been approved, so we clearly have a long way to go to fully implement the trash amendments, but once implemented, they can be a real game changer at the local level to prevent trash from entering water bodies. Next slide, please. The other area that the Water Board is very active in right now is in microplastics in our drinking water. SB 1422, next slide, please. SB 1422, which passed in 2018, thank you, required the state water boards to assess microplastics in California's drinking water. To do so, they had to actually define what microplastics are. So in June of 2020, the water boards adopted a formal definition of microplastics, which makes California the first state to do so. They are in the midst of adopting a monitoring playbook, which is expected to be adopted in May, and that will be followed by several years of testing. First, 2 years of testing in source water, and then finally 2 more years of testing in drinking water. Now, all of these results are going to be required to be communicated to the public, so the State Water Board and partners will be undertaking a big effort to effectively communicate these results to make sure this does not drive people to drink bottled water instead, both from the standpoint of not wanting to create yet another piece of plastic pollution by buying a water bottle, but also because testing has revealed that bottled water actually has up to 3 times the amount of microplastics as our tap water does. Next slide. Another somewhat unexpected player in the plastic pollution realm is the California Department of Public Health's Tobacco Control Program. They've actually been active in the plastic pollution realm for well over a decade. As we know from Coastal Cleanup Day data, cigarette filters are the most littered item in California, and they are made up of single-use plastic. Addressing cigarette filters and tobacco waste is yet another avenue for the Tobacco Control Program to lower smoking rates in the state. They're going to be launching a new ad campaign in May that shows the link between microplastics and cigarette filters, since each filter can break up into as many as 15,000 plastic microfibers. Next slide, please. There are a host of other state agencies that are involved in efforts around plastic pollution. Just for a few examples, the Department of Toxics and Substance Control could identify microplastics as a priority product under its Safer Consumer Products program, which could then allow them to add it to the candidate chemicals list. This gives them the opportunity to evaluate products that could potentially give rise to microplastics and make producers evaluate alternatives to those products. State Parks is clearly a player in this field, both as a land manager and as leaders of volunteer beach cleanups. They've also been extremely active through our shared clean boating program in posting fishing line recycling stations throughout California. Other agencies like the State Lands Commission, the Office of Environmental Health and Hazard Assessment, Caltrans, Fish and Wildlife Commission, and of course the Ocean Protection Council are all active in this field. One of the reasons why there are so many agencies working on plastic pollution is that there is no single state agency that has a mandate to handle the entire marine debris issue. There are many agencies that cover pieces of this very complex puzzle. That's why the OPC's role as a convener is so critical to our work moving forward collaboratively. We'll hear from OPC in a few minutes about their recently adopted microplastic strategy, but in addition to that work, the OPC has been the state's lead on our statewide ocean litter strategy and has also been hosting a plastic pollution steering committee made up of the state agency representatives you see here. This has been an extremely useful and effective means of sharing information across agencies that enhances our work and helps us avoid duplication. Now, California is by far the lead on this issue in the US, but there are other levels of government looking closely at this issue. Next slide, please. At the federal level, the NOAA Marine Debris Program, in addition to running a number of grant programs aimed at marine debris removal and research, is the lead agency in the Interagency Marine Debris Coordinating Committee. The IMDCC, which also includes the EPA,
Recording in
State
progress.
Department, and multiple other federal agencies, is responsible for coordinating a comprehensive program of marine debris research and activities among federal agencies. Next slide, please. At the beginning of 2021, the Save Our Seas 2.0 Act was signed into law. This was passed on a bipartisan basis, actually by voice approval. It's a follow-on to the original Save Our Seas Act from 2018. The new bill has many different parts. Oh, that got cut off a little bit, unfortunately. There are many different components to this bill, but really one of the most important from our standpoint is that it authorized a host of new studies from the National Academy of Sciences. Next slide, please. The first of these reports was just issued this past December on reckoning with the US role in global ocean plastic waste. This is really the first comprehensive look at what we know about plastic pollution across the United States, from its sources, its transport mechanisms, its fate, the impacts of plastic pollution, and ultimately what we might be able to do about it. It was one of the first federal calls for a reduction in the production of plastic at its source. There are other studies on microplastics, derelict fishing gear, and others that are also on the way, thanks to this new bill. Finally, next slide, please. At the international level, there are two items of note that I'd like to bring your attention to. The first is the 7th International Marine Debris Conference. This is a conference that's held fairly rarely, only every 4 to 5 years or so. This will be hosted by NOAA, the United Nations Environment Program, and the Republic of South Korea. The conference will be in Busan, South Korea this September. And if past conferences are any indication, it's an excellent opportunity to help further the research and international and regional collaboration on these issues. It is worth noting that the call for abstracts just opened, and if anyone is interested, you can check out their website at 7indc.org. Finally, next slide, please. This is perhaps the most exciting development in the world of plastic pollution for some time. A recently passed resolution that it will create a global agreement to end plastic pollution. The United Nations Environment Assembly of 175 countries, including the US, agreed to the resolution at the beginning of March. This is expected to produce a legally binding treaty by the end of 2024. This is the largest and really the most important international agreement that we've seen since the Paris Accords. Next slide, please. With that, I'd like to say thank you for allowing me to give you this quick tour through the world of current actions on macroplastic. And now I'd like to turn this over to Caitlin Kalua from the Ocean Protection Council to give you information on the latest developments in microplastic.
Great, thank you, Evan. I also have a slide deck, perfect. Good morning, commissioners. My name is Caitlin Kalua. I'm the Water Quality Program Manager for the California Ocean Protection Council, and I'm presenting today on the recently adopted statewide microplastic strategy, followed by Mark Gold, Deputy Secretary for Ocean and Coastal Policy. Next slide, please. The Ocean Protection Council is a state cabinet level body whose mission is to ensure the health, resilience, and productivity of California's ocean and coastal ecosystems. As Evan mentioned, OPC is committed to coordinated statewide action to reduce marine debris and plastic pollution with the development and implementation of the California Ocean Litter Strategy, facilitation of the Interagency Plastic Pollution Steering Committee, the endorsement of the top 10 recommendations to address plastic pollution in 2021, and the adoption of the statewide microplastic strategy in February of this year, which is the focus of my presentation today. Next slide, please. Senate Bill 1263, adopted by the California legislature in 2018, required OPC to develop the statewide microplastic strategy in consultation with state agency partners, including the California Coastal Commission. The strategy was adopted on February 23rd of 2022, with the overarching goal to increase the state's understanding of the scale and risk of microplastics in California's marine environment, and to identify early actions to manage microplastic pollution. Consistent with this statute, OPC is committed to reporting additional findings and recommendations to the legislature by December 31st of 2025. And excuse me, this was not all bold in my draft, so I do apologize for the large font here. Next slide, please. The strategy reflects the microplastics definition adopted by the State Water Resources Control Board in 2020, which recognizes microplastics as polymers with chemical or other additives that are at least 3 dimensions and 1 nanometer to 5 millimeters in size. Microplastics fall into 2 general categories: primary microplastics that are intentionally manufactured at this small size. This includes pre-production plastic pellets used in manufacturing known as nurdles, or microbeads in personal care products, or otherwise secondary microplastics that result from the breakdown of larger plastics. Next slide, please. California is at the forefront of microplastic science and research. Research completed in the San Francisco Bay in 2019, funded in part by OPC, found microplastic pollution in every part of the bay. Stormwater was found to be a primary way by which microplastics enter the bay, with wastewater also a known while smaller contributor of microplastic pollution into marine waters. The study also found vehicle tires to be a predominant source of microplastics into the bay, with microfibers from synthetic clothing and fibers from cigarette filters also identified. Following the study, there's an overarching need to learn whether the trends seen in the San Francisco Bay are similar in other regions of the state. Next slide, please. In developing the statewide microplastic strategy, the OPC Science Advisory Team released an initial risk assessment framework in 2021 that recognized that microplastics are pervasive and ubiquitous in the environment, are persistent, and are only expected to increase. The OPC SAT recommended a precautionary particulate management approach of microplastics, similar to the particulate matter approach under the Clean Air Act, and emphasized upstream pollution prevention as the most important way to reduce microplastic pollution, given it is difficult, if not impossible, to remove microplastics once they enter the environment. Concurrently, the State Water Resources Control Board and Southern California Coastal Water Research Project recently identified preliminary risk thresholds for aquatic life, which recognize the harm caused by the ingestion of microplastics by small organisms. Next slide, please. The final strategy was informed by these findings, resulting in a 2-track approach that recognizes the need to take immediate action to reduce microplastic pollution, while simultaneously advancing a research strategy that will enhance our understanding of microplastics statewide. The statewide microplastic strategy provides a multi-year roadmap with 22 recommended early actions and 13 research priorities for California to take a national and global leadership role in managing microplastic pollution. This includes pollution prevention to eliminate plastic waste at its source, pathway interventions such as stormwater and wastewater to intervene with the transport of microplastics, and outreach and education to inform and encourage systemic change. Research priorities include statewide monitoring, updated risk thresholds, prioritization of sources and pathways to target areas with the highest levels of microplastics, and evaluating new solutions to ensure California is effective in curbing this microplastic pollution. Next slide, please. At the forefront of this strategy is the recognition that plastic pollution is pervasive but preventable. As one example, the statewide plastic bag ban adopted in 2014 and implemented in 2016 has successfully decreased plastic in California's waters. Recent results from the Southern California BIPE Regional Monitoring Program have shown a significant decrease in the presence of plastic bags in Southern California watersheds between 2013 and 2018, in large part due to the implementation of the statewide plastic bag ban. Next slide, please. Similarly, the strategy includes recommendations to reduce the production and use of plastics that break down into microplastics. This includes comprehensive statewide plastic source reduction, reuse, and refill goals, and the elimination of specific single-use plastic products that are not readily recyclable and are known to contribute to microplastic pollution. This includes expanded polystyrene, intentionally added microplastics, and single-use tobacco products and filters. Economic strategies may also be pursued, such as advancing extended producer responsibility or promoting improvements in household appliances that have a demonstrated ability to reduce microplastic emissions. This includes washing machines and clothing dryers. Finally, the strategy proposes 5 targeted sector-specific workshops to be held over the next 2 years to identify plastic alternatives and recommendations to prevent plastic waste in these sectors. Next slide, please. Second, the strategy includes early recommendations to intervene with the flow of microplastics in California's waters. The strategy recommends supporting the multiple benefits of green infrastructure and low impact development, known as LID, By incorporating these requirements into appropriate permits, such as coastal development permits, compliance with existing discharge prohibitions for trash and pre-production plastics known as MRTLs, intercepting plastic debris located in high-use beaches, recreational areas, and encampments adjacent to waterways, and achieving the 2030 compliance deadline of the State Water Board's statewide trash provisions. Wastewater recycling and wastewater facility upgrades are also effective in filtering microplastics and can provide multiple benefits, such as augmenting local water supplies. However, pollution prevention, such as preventing synthetic microfibers from entering wastewater treatment plants, by example, improving washing machine filtration, is needed to prevent microplastics from entering these systems in the first place, and to prevent microplastics from either entering California's waters or being applied to land, given the byproduct of wastewater treatment plants is often used as a soil amendment. Finally, while the transport of microplastics in air has yet to be assessed statewide, initial studies have demonstrated the use of condenser dryers, improved filtration, or choosing to hang dry clothes in lieu of a dryer as one approach to reduce airborne microplastic fibers. Next slide, please. Finally, the solutions track includes actions related to outreach and education to engage impacted communities, raise awareness of microplastic pollution, and to facilitate systemic change. Next slide, please. The second track of the strategy builds from recent advancements in microplastic science and details an overarching multi-year research strategy to shape the next generation of management solutions. The research priorities call for coordinated, simultaneous investments across 4 main areas: monitoring, including the creation of a statewide monitoring network, risk thresholds and assessment to inform future regulatory action, sources and pathways prioritization, and evaluating new management solutions. Next slide, please. Through this research strategy, California is positioned to inform national and international efforts that aim to track and end ongoing plastic and microplastic pollution. This includes supporting the commitments outlined in the March 2022 United Nations resolution and subsequent treaty that is anticipated to be developed in 2024 to end global plastic pollution, including microplastics. Next slide, please. The final strategy requires coordination and implementation by a range of state, federal, and local partners, and will inform state actions and investments over the next 4 years. OPC is committed to using the findings from these actions and research priorities to inform additional recommendations as a next generation of solutions to the legislature by December of 2025. Next slide, please. Finally, the public is encouraged to become engaged in the implementation of the strategy by participating in the Water Quality Monitoring Council Microplastics Subcommittee and the OPC NOAA Marine Debris Program's facilitation of the California Ocean Litter Strategy. Relevant links are provided on this slide. Next slide, please. Thank you. I will now turn to OPC Executive Director and Deputy Secretary for Ocean and Coastal Policy, Mark Gold, for closing remarks.
Thanks, Caitlin, and excellent job, Evan and Sarah, as always. A couple of things I just want to bring up in closing, which is one, good news, if you hadn't heard, is LA County Board of Supervisors yesterday actually passed on first reading a single-use plastics ordinance for LA County unincorporated area. That's about 1.3 million people. But anyways, good to sort of see that progress occurring. The other thing from the standpoint of how this world changes, it seems like on a daily basis because of all the research going on, is that, you know, recent research outcomes include finding microplastics in the bloodstream, finding microplastics in our lungs, and then recently finding microplastics in the most remote places on the face of the planet through marine snow. I'm sure people caught that in the New York Times. I think it was just a couple of days ago. So I'm proud of the fact that the state were the first in the nation, probably in the world, to put together a comprehensive microplastic strategy. But we're really gonna have to move towards a plan to actual action. And Caitlin laid out all the actions that need to occur. They're not gonna be easy. They're not gonna be cheap. To that end, you have a commitment from me here today that we will put at least $3 million towards implementation of the microplastic strategy and plastics reduction recommendations within the next year or so. And so we really want to get that going. You saw some of the biggest highlights that Caitlin was saying, that we got to get the science right first. We got to get monitoring going in a real way, but it can't all be done in parallel. And I think one of the big things in working with the scientific community, whether it was State Water Board or the Ocean Science Trust, or Professor Suzanne Brander and Chelsea Rockman, who were so instrumental in this work, San Francisco Estuary Institute and SQUIRP, we all agree that this has to be a precautionary approach. You can't wait to find out what the toxicity is of all the microplastics on all the various different marine organisms to move forward. You have to assume if there's really high concentrations of microplastics, that there's a likely problem. And that's really the mindset that we've taken as a state in moving forward. And I just wanted to share that with you because it's one thing to sort of think about all the various different toxicants that are in the plastics themselves or sorbed to the microplastics. It's another thing just to think about how ubiquitous and growing this microplastics problem has become. And the more studies that we find, none of them are making the situation look a lot better. So anyways, we're here to sort of close on that and let you know that OPC has a firm commitment in really trying to make sure that this strategy gets implemented. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Gold. You were speaking to us in your role as the executive director of the Ocean Protection Council, and the microplastics policy that was just adopted is critically important. Thank you, Mr. Schwartz and Ms. Christie, for your presentations. And so, Mr. Lee, do we have public comment? And can you tell me how many speakers we have?
There are no public commenters for this item.
Okay, there's no public commenters for this item. Then I'm going to bring it back to commissioners for comments and questions. Vice Chair Hart.
Thank you so much, Chair Brownsy. I want to start by recognizing my fellow commissioners, initially Commissioner Amanzada, for her role in the drafting and as a proponent of the initiative, which is now qualified for the ballot in November, formerly known as the California Plastic Waste Reduction Regulations Initiative of 2022. And for those that are listening, I think there's a very good summary of it on Ballotpedia online that outlines all the different, what the initiative would do, who the proponents are, et cetera. So I would refer people to that. I would also like to acknowledge and appreciate my fellow Commissioner Linda Escalante, who with myself is a proponent of the ballot measure, and I know she will be speaking probably in more detail and in a much more educated fashion than I am regarding this. But I will say this, that I don't need to tell the people here or the people listening that plastics, the topic of plastics has become the most vexing, complicated, and I would argue one of the most important issues of our day. I'm so grateful for the presentation of Eben Schwartz and also of Deputy Director Christie, as well as the other speakers, including OPC Director Gold today. But I'm sure I don't need to tell anyone here that plastics have become just an absolutely monstrous problem, to the extent they're everywhere. Plastics are in us. There's a great documentary that NPR did on plastics that shows when fish are open, or fish that are killed, that are fished and open, their bellies are full of plastic. And soon, I'm sure most people have heard that there will be more plastic than fish in the ocean. And the entrapments and the horror that we see on the slides that Mr. Schwartz presented, and that we see all over, the impacts on wildlife just cannot be overstated, and the impacts on humans. It's just an issue that we must do something about. In addition, many people don't realize that plastics are a huge contribution to greenhouse gas emissions, and climate change that's occurring throughout the planet. A new report that was released recently suggested that plastics will release more greenhouse gas emissions than coal plants in the United States by 2030. In California, we dump more than 12,000 tons of plastic into landfills every day, enough to fill 219 Olympic-sized swimming pools, according to CalRecycle, every day. So again, I don't think that there is anyone that is here in this room or listening today that could understate the importance of strongly addressing the problem of plastics. And how do we do that? By regulating the production of single-use plastics. And that is why I have joined with Commissioner Escalante to support the Plastic Waste Reduction Regulations Initiative. And of course, we're supportive of legislation. But we've seen, and it's just been recounted by Deputy Director Christie, the difficulty in getting this through the legislature. And this is the moment where we have an opportunity. This initiative is qualified for the ballot. And now is the moment for Californians to step up and say, we want to do something. We do not want our children and our children's children bodies to be filled with plastic, with toxics. And we do not want the ocean to be filled with more plastic than fish. We are going to take a stand and do something about this issue. And that's what the initiative does. If there's legislation that mirrors the initiative, contains the enforcement mechanisms of the initiative, then that's something that I'm sure as proponents, we're going to be working with the legislature on. But as it exists today, we're moving forward with the initiative. It'll be on the ballot in November, absent any changes. And again, I'm just so grateful, and I would turn it over to Commissioner Escalante for her comments.
Thank you, Vice Chair Hart. Commissioner Escalante.
Thank you, Vice Chair Hart and Chair Brownsy. First, thank Ms. Christie and Mr. Schwartz for the very helpful report, and of course the Ocean Protection Council for their leadership on this matter. And you know, it would be also remiss to not thank Senator Allen and you know, all the legislators for their work to tackle plastic pollution head on and comprehensively. I think ultimately that's everybody's goal. But you know, from cradle to grave, single-use plastic products have been a huge problem, as you know, Commissioner Hart said. Climate change, for wildlife, for oceans and waterways, our waste management systems, local governments, and people's health. And single-use plastic debris is a land problem before it becomes an ocean problem. And of course, it is a human problem that we must deal with. And plastics are petrochemicals. You know, they're sourced from the same fossil fuels that are causing climate chaos, which is getting worse every day. So, and oil and chemical companies are looking at plastics as their growing arm of business as our society tries to shift away from gasoline and fossil gas, or as we know it as natural gas. We can't recycle our way of the problem. I think we have figured this out. Recycling has been actually a very big green lie, because instead of being reutilized, these materials mostly end up in landfills or incinerators. And despite consumers' contributions to the blue bin, this is the case. And since we can no longer ship our trash to poor countries, sort of, you know, throw a veil over our intentions, we can't keep on pretending that we are doing something useful with them. So our current systems are bursting at the seams. I think if you talk to any local government, they will tell you that they just cannot afford to deal with these materials, which is why City of Los Angeles, unanimously, their city council supported the ballot initiative. And I think this is why you're seeing this, you know, movements from across the state. I personally don't have faith in for-profit industries to police themselves, since, you know, it was them who created the recycling rules to begin with. So, and this is just to continue externalizing the real cost of their products onto the public and the environment. So this is why I'm one of those proud proponents of the initiative, and it may not be perfect, and I know that it won't make everyone happy, But I think it's bold and it's intentional. And most importantly, it does respond to the public's concerns and their desire to reduce plastic pollution. And it also responds to the need to generate funds for the implementation of this program, to set up the facilities. And also, you know, we have a third of the funds that will be, the ballot initiative is going to try to get will be for restoration and conservation projects for the environment, which is something that I know that legislation will have a hard time getting. So, and I think this is, you know, the fact that we were able to get 700,000 signatures right before, very short amount of time, right before the stay-home order fell. During the pandemic, when nobody could go, you know, collect signatures at grocery stores, you know, shows that the public really wants this to happen. I wanted to address, you know, a polluter's attack on the initiative or the legislation, actually, if it has a funding mechanism, and it's that somehow this is a consumer punishing tax, and it is not. It is a polluter punishing tax, and it's about time that producers account for the cost that the public and the environment have borne, because most of these costs also are disproportionately borne by poor communities of color. And I wanted to just address that piece because it's not just about the environmental justice issues connected to climate change that we are all very aware of. In April 2021, a report titled Neglected Environmental Justice Impacts of Plastic Pollution, and this was published by the UN Environmental Program and Azul, one of the activists that comes to the commission. You know, and they're a leading US-based environmental justice and ocean advocacy organization. That report brought into focus the enormous human, social cost and disproportionate impact of the entire life cycle of plastic pollution, especially in the most vulnerable people around the world, not just in our country, in our state. You know, plastic pollution in the oceans threatens the food chain and livelihood of millions of people who depend on the marine environment for sustenance. Waste and processing facilities, such as recycling plants, landfill incinerators, chemical recycling facilities, and refineries that are producing the raw product, they're concentrated in low-income marginalized communities. And as a result, so is the dirty air and the dirty water and all of, you know, things, the consequences that come with that. So the waste industry is also one of the most dangerous for laborers, and I learned this when I was working in City of LA trying to transform their waste system to zero waste, work closely with Teamsters. And in part, it was sort of realizing that, you know, once you throw it away into the blue bin and maybe it will be processed in some facility, there's going to be a human being who's picking through that trash. And oftentimes, it's not just, you know, cardboard or plastic jugs, but there's all kinds of dangerous things in there that people just throw in the blue bin as well. So it is one of the most dangerous jobs in the country. And, you know, most of the people that are working there are sort of out of sight, out of mind from labor force, including immigrants and women and people of color. So I think that workers and the most vulnerable must be protected from the harms of our dependence on single-use plastics. So I appreciate this opportunity, and I hope that however it plays out, we all get your support.
Thank you both to Vice Chair Hart and to Commissioner Escalante for your presentation, substantive presentations, really important. Commissioner Amanzada.
Thank you. Just to briefly chime in and echo the comments of Commissioner Hart and Escalante, this is a big day, I think, for the Coastal Commission. For years, we've hosted and operated the coastal cleanup to remove trash from our beaches and coasts, and today we're talking about addressing the source and the root causes, and that's really powerful. And I'm deeply grateful to our staff, to all of the NGOs who have been involved in this for years, of which I was a part. Many of us worked for 8 years to pass the plastic bag ban, and so to be sitting here today looking at this really comprehensive reform to really change the way that plastics exist in our state is incredible. So yeah, I'm just really grateful that this is moving forward, and strongly support it and proud to have been involved in the development and now as an endorser, and I encourage others to do so as well. You can sign up to endorse it online. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Amanzada. Commissioner Uranga.
Thank you, Chair Brownsie. as a member of the city council in Long Beach and being a municipal entity, we had a plastic bag ban ordinance passed. We also passed a ban on plastic straws. And I know it was a lifetime ago, but the last time we had a meeting in Long Beach, I gave you guys some straws and some reusable forks and spoons so that we could use it at our Coastal Commission meetings. And how many of you brought it? I'm glad to hear that because, obviously, I think we've been there you go. I think we've been piecemealing this kinds of ordinances and bills for a long time. And I'm glad to see that finally, we're going to get something that is going to be implemented statewide. It's been long overdue, and we've all been working towards it. And like I say, we've been piecemealing it with a county or with a city or, individually. And I think that this all-encompassing type of legislation would go a long way in solving our green gas emissions, as well as just the waste that's out there in the world and it accumulates. So I'm very happy to support this. And I want to thank staff for working on putting this together. And of course, our two champions over here who put that legislation together. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Uranga. And, we so rarely get swag when we attend a meeting, so it was really great to get those. And while I didn't bring mine this meeting, I will not forget next meeting. Okay, Commissioner Rice.
Yeah, I just want to add on my thanks to the plastic champions, and also my thanks to my fellow my colleagues in local government, because it really, the move to ban first plastic bags and then food service, single-use plastics in food service, that started at the local level and builds upwards. And so in the meantime, while this initiative goes on the ballot, I think local government has to continue to push forward on our own individual efforts. And to that end, we actually, at our Marin County Board of Supervisors, will be hearing an item for a new ordinance, a revised ordinance on April 19th, that will regulate the use of single-use plastics for all prepared food vendors throughout unincorporated Marin, and some of our cities and towns are doing the same thing. So it aligns well with everything that's in place at the state level, and local government needs to continue to sort of do the march and do the small muscle moves as we move the entire state along. So thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Rice. And I think that's so important at the local level because it's the accountability is a bit more, immediate. And so I want to thank everybody for all of the comments that were made. They were so important on this issue. Every time I see those pictures, I'm so revolted. It's just so horrifying that places of beauty have been turned into dumps by our choices in terms of how we live in this modern world. I mean, I remember, it's the miracle of chemistry, right? That's how we have plastics. And now I do believe that the balance has shifted, because is it really worth it that we're jeopardizing our rivers and oceans and all the creatures that live in this world? And now we're jeopardizing ourselves because plastics are in us. They're in the food we eat. They're in the air we breathe, the water we drink. And so I think it is incumbent upon us to fully embrace strategies to address this most pernicious problem. And so I want to thank everybody for their comments and for the presentations, which were excellent. And perhaps this will give us some little bit of hope that things can change in the future. Okay. Thank you all to the staff. Let's finish the executive director's report with the commission resolution. Mr. Ainsworth, do we take?
Thank you, Madam Chair. This is item 6E, and the commission's resolution to eliminate the commission's use of single-use plastics. And Sarah Christie is going to kick this off.